Most of the evidence that I present here concerning Matthew Franklin Whittier's literary legacy is of the circumstantial type, and that's because Matthew kept himself so deeply hidden, and you really have to dig into the historical record, and one thing depends on another, which depends on another, and I've described it as a giant tapestry. And I've tried to present as much of the evidence in as logical a way as I can in these video blogs, but it takes time, and I'm really only able to scratch the surface. And because some of Matthew's accomplishments were huge, of course, that makes it all seem implausible, and people are understandably not willing to devote that much time to dig into it to see whether it's genuine or not, because it just seems very implausible on the surface of it. So that's, a problem, but every once in a while I run across a smoking gun like this one. And what I'm going to do today is to present a smoking gun that I discovered fairly recently. And I'm just going to skim over the top of the background for this, just so you have some idea what we're talking about, especially if you haven't followed this blog. And then I'm just going to present the smoking gun. And the nature of smoking guns is they should be self-evident. They shouldn't take a whole lot of background. This is not cumulative evidence. This is something that's just logically in your face, proves the case, right? So what we're talking about is George Pickering Burnham, who was a con artist, apparently a wealthy con artist, who, along with a fellow named Francis A. Durivage, swindled Matthew, probably by a bogus contract, in early 1848. And they swindled him out of a huge portfolio of unpublished works of two varieties. It was humorous anecdotes based on real life and a series of swashbuckling romantic adventure stories, mostly set in other countries. And again, it was a vast portfolio, and no sooner had Matthew set pen to paper and signed away his rights to this huge thing than they started publishing. And it went on for several years, but the bulk of it was published in 1848 and 1849. So in 1855, George Burnham published a book called The History of the Hen Fever. Now, this was based on one of the stolen humorous anecdotes, but it was not one of the ones that, they divvied them up between the two of them and pretended that George Burnham was Francis Durivage's protege, which was their explanation as to how they sounded exactly the same, and were just of the same quality, which was, they had no track record of their own, so it was impossible that they could have written this material in the first place. But anyway, one of the pieces that Francis Durivage took as his own and assigned his pseudonym to had to do with the hen fever. Well, the hen fever was this Chinese breed of chickens, which was huge, but really was not of very high quality. And people started selling them in the United States, and they got to be hugely popular because of their size. And it was a scam, basically, because finally they realized that this wasn't really very good chicken, Well, anyway, that's what Matthew wrote the story about, because Matthew was raised on a farm, so he knew about raising chickens. And he did it to warn people. This is why Matthew would write about scams, was to warn people primarily. I mean, they amused him, but he was really trying to, educate the public. Well, Francis Durivage, of course, published it because those were really con artists and it amused them. And then George Burnham, whose hobby was raising chickens, actually pulled the scam. He perpetrated the scam on the public and then wrote this book about it and published it in early 1855. So he got money off the scam, and then he got money off of bragging about the fact that he'd pulled the scam, see? Well, Matthew wrote about this. He wrote an anonymous review in March 31, 1855 edition of the Portland Transcript, exposing him. And, it was a scathing review because he said basically he's a scam artist who bragged about his own scam. Then Matthew published an anonymous social reform novel, 431 pages, a huge novel. The first half of it had to do with temperance and the evils of alcoholism. And the second half of it was an anti-slavery book that had to do with the Underground Railroad and so on. He published it anonymously. In the front of the book is a dedication to his sister, which of course is not signed, but it's clearly to Elizabeth Whittier. And a week later, William Lloyd Garrison in his newspaper, The Liberator, gave it a glowing review, put extended excerpts in it, two successive editions of his paper, The Liberator. And then 2 months later, nobody knew who wrote this because it was anonymous, was apparently very well received. 2 months later, George Burnham buys a bookselling company, attaches his name to the front, lists this book for sale with his name on it, and gets that in 2 or 3 papers in Boston, briefly, where they say, oh, the author of the Rag Picker, or Bound and Free, which is the name of the book, has been discovered, and it's George Burnham. Well, that only appears in a couple papers in Boston, and then it's all forgotten, see? So he did not successfully pull the scam. But it so happens that the claim was picked up in a couple bibliographies. And one of them was History of Middlesex County, Massachusetts by D. Hamilton Hurd. And then in another book, a more recent book by Lyle H. Wright called American Fiction, 1851 to 1875. Well, apparently Wright is like a major authority on this subject. So a librarian, when she got a copy of this book, and I'll show you what the title page looks like with the name on it, she penciled in George Burnham's name because she believed Lyle H. Wright, see, who was an authority. And then from there, it went through the entire system. It went viral through the library system and the print-on-demand booksellers and so on. Well, I wrote a paper about this. It was peer-reviewed. It got accepted by Academia EDU, which is kind of quasi-academic. And it's just a short paper because I was limited to 1,600 words. But it's a pretty compelling argument that I make in that paper. It's been seen by, 2,500 people at this point. It's pretty popular. It's like in the 3%, I think, of all their articles. And I sent that to WorldCat OCLC, who is one of the major authorities in terms of book attribution and book listings. And they signed off on it to the extent of adding Matthew Franklin Whittier as a possible author for the book, indicating that it's disputed. See, well, they're a major authority. So then I went and wrote to every library that held the book and brought that to their attention individually, and all the booksellers. And some percentage of them changed their listings. Some of the libraries automatically go by whatever OCLC says. So that listing is revised in some percentage of the libraries now. Well, after all that was done, and I had some pretty compelling evidence, circumstantial evidence. After all that was done, I found the smoking gun. So what I want to do is to share that with you. Now, in a book, this won't take very long because it's, it either works or it doesn't work for you, This is in The History of Temperance Reform in Massachusetts, 1813 to 1883. It's by George Faber Clark, and it was published in 1888. And we see there's a whole chapter devoted to George Burnham. And the gist of it is that the governor needed to hire a liquor agent. And the liquor agent was responsible during this time of prohibition, was responsible for all the state-owned liquor. And of course, he wasn't supposed to touch it himself. Well, the temperance people were up in arms because they knew he was a con artist. And they said, you can't, it's like a fox guarding the hen house. They didn't use those words, but I'm sure many of them did privately. You can't put this guy in charge of the liquor. He's already scammed the public once, see? And then later on, he was charged with having stolen the liquor and watered it down, And they accused him and they subpoenaed his financial records. He refused to provide them, lying that he only had his personal records. And he was arrested and put in jail and then eventually released. And then eventually he was relieved of his position. So clearly there was two powerful factions. There was the people that put him in, and there was the people that wanted him out, and they kept fighting back and forth. But it's pretty clear that he actually did that. He stole the liquor and drank it with his friends and just put water in it, But that's not the proof. I mean, that's bad enough because this is a deeply moral social reform novel. And I already know that he's a racist and he couldn't possibly have written it. I mean, there's the cumulative evidence itself is pretty smoking, But here's the smoking gun. On page 96, and I'll put it up on the screen, we read, in the spring of 1858, it became necessary to fill a vacancy that had arisen in the office of the agent. It was rumored that the governor intended to appoint to the position Mr. George P. Burnham, who had become quite notorious by the publication of a book relative to the hen fever, wherein, according to the Temperance Visitor, he exulted, quote, unblushingly over the manner in which he had humbugged the community. Consequently, he was not deemed by the Friends of Temperance a suitable person to take charge of the agency where there was so great an opportunity for fraud. Now, here's the point of all of this. These temperance leaders were not aware that George Burnham had claimed the rag picker. It was a popular, well-known book. They weren't aware of it, or they were aware that he had briefly attempted to associate his name with it, and they didn't take it seriously. But 3 years after Matthew had published The Rag Picker, George Burnham was not known as the author of it. Therefore, we can definitely prove that his brief attempt to associate his name with it either was forgotten or was laughed off. That's our smoking gun, and hope you'd enjoyed it. I have quite a few more. I have at least one concerning Charles Dickens' supposed authorship of A Christmas Carol, and the other attributions. I've got smoking guns for them also, but people never get around to them because they've already written me off before I even get a chance to present them. But this is a little case, there's no terribly famous piece of literature that's attached to this one. So same modus operandi. I've got a smoking gun. I've got a lot of cumulative evidence. I can prove these things, but that's what a smoking gun looks like.